Senate Committee on Finance, Subcommittee on International Trade, Customs, and Global Competitiveness will come to order. I know this seems a little strange with an empty room except for 3 witnesses live in front of me, and many of our colleagues are going to be joining us virtually. But I want to welcome all of you nonetheless to this important hearing. This subcommittee continues to do its work in exploring the unfair trade practices of foreign governments, especially China and Russia. The topic of censorship in China is a common one because of its growing effect on business in the United States as well as culture. Last fall, for example, the National Basketball Association had its market access blocked in China because an individual American citizen using a media platform not even allowed in China expressed a political opinion. Now the topic has become much more important. The lack of timely, accurate information about the spread of COVID-19 due to Chinese censorship has contributed to the havoc wreaked on our economy and health, and indeed the pandemic. This story is nothing new. For some joining us today, Chinese censorship has long been growing, and it's long had a negative effect on people around the world, such as those in Tibet or the Uyghurs in China's Xinjiang province. First, I want to set the scene for what censorship actually is, and a simple dictionary definition is a good place to start. The suppression or prohibition of any parts of media that are considered obscene, politically unacceptable, or a threat to security. Today, we'll focus on how the use of censorship has become a barrier to global trade. When the World Trade Organization was founded, 2 exceptions to the principles of national treatment and most favored nation were created. Those are for public morals and national security. Notably, there's no exception for a country to restrict trade because it deems something politically unacceptable. With discussions over reforming the WTO, multilateral talks on e-commerce, and the prospect of a Phase 2 bilateral trade deal with China progressing, the subcommittee is uniquely positioned to inform Congress, the public, and the executive branch on the use of censorship as a non-tariff barrier to trade. We will help determine if the suppression of information, data, goods, and services via digital media by countries like China constitute a trade barrier in violation of the WTO, as well as multilateral and bilateral agreements and practices. If so, we will look to determine the economic damage caused, the human, cultural, business, and political ramifications, and what remedies are currently available or should be created to combat this unfair trade practice. On a bilateral basis, what is clear is the lack of reciprocity from countries like China or Russia and the United States. The Chinese government spends billions of dollars to promote its propaganda overseas, a form of offensive censorship. For years, Russia has broadcast state propaganda in the United States and has justly been designated as a foreign agent. The lack of reciprocity takes advantage of our system of free expression to promote these countries' agenda online, in media, entertainment, as well as our education system. Meanwhile, China and Russia do not grant the United States the same access to its markets or media. Instead, China has been expelling our media, having kicked out 3 Wall Street Journal and other reporters earlier this year over Chinese censorship of COVID-19. For centuries, countries blocked trade through physically restricting access to their ports. Today, the same thing happens, but with firewalls, filters, and outright restrictions to access. In fact, nearly 100% of global internet traffic travels through a crisscrossing network of undersea cables that form the backbone of global digital trade. These cables are another front in the global technology race, with companies like Huawei Marine rapidly moving to control the media by which content and trade is censored. In the era of information where data is the new gold, the blocking or filtering of that traffic by nation states is growing. This censorship is fragmenting our markets, culture, and understanding of one another. The internet itself is becoming less global. Countries like China and Russia are not only building their own infrastructure to cut themselves off from the world, but exporting their authoritarian model to other nation states through efforts such as the Digital Silk Road. It's imperative that Congress support our nation in meeting this challenge, and that's why I'm working together with all of our colleagues in the Senate and in the House to include parts of the CHIPS for America Act in the National Defense Authorization Bill currently on the Senate floor. If we're forced to rely on China to build our networks and our technology, the world we know will be much less freer and open to expression of opinions and do business. This bill will help us create our own domestic production capacity for high-end semiconductors that underpin the technology we use in our daily lives. It will also let the United States remain a global leader in promoting free trade of goods, information, and speech. Finally, I look forward to discussing what remedies are available to address the abuse of censorship as a non-tariff barrier to trade. Last fall, a Chinese-American constituent of mine in Texas reported he was censored here on American soil by the Chinese government. His American WeChat account was shut down for supporting protests in Hong Kong. His response was, quote, "If you have censorship in China, fine. But in this country, I'm a Republican, but I suffer the same as Democrats. We're all censored." I look forward to exploring this topic in the same bipartisan fashion in which we always hope to proceed. It's time for Congress to ask hard questions, and that's why we've called our panel of 4 experts here today to discuss this issue. Let me now recognize Ranking Member Casey.
Mr. Chairman, thanks very much for this hearing, and I want to thank our witnesses for being with us today. This is, as the chairman has noted, the third in a series of hearings held by the subcommittee outlining Chinese government's civil-military agenda and efforts to influence the economic and geopolitical order in a manner that benefits its authoritarian and anti-competitive practices. Just yesterday, the Chinese National People's Congress passed a national security law for Hong Kong that significantly erodes Hong Kong's special status and, based on available reporting, will deny the people of Hong Kong the right to protest, the right to assemble, or the right to criticize their government. The United States Congress has been clear time and again: the citizens of Hong Kong must enjoy certain rights that are distinct from mainland China, and efforts to undermine the status quo is an affront to the people of Hong Kong and decades of international agreement regarding the status of Hong Kong. As I've said before, when it comes to China, we must work with our allies to execute a clear and coordinated strategy. This applies to trade and to the Chinese government's most recent efforts to erode the rights of the people of Hong Kong. Here in the United States at this time, we know that we're in the midst of a public health and jobs crisis. So much suffering all across our country. We've seen the cost of our reliance in the context of this pandemic, this public health crisis, our reliance on a single source supplier, and more to the point, our reliance on production from a non-market economy. Last year, Senator Cornyn and I began this effort by outlining the main issues related to market access in China. We then focused on specific initiatives and actions undertaken by the Chinese government, starting with the Belt and Road Initiative. Today, we turn our attention to censorship. The actions undertaken by the Chinese government include direct barriers, such as blocking movies from entering their market, or restricting content, to blocking internet firms, to dictating content related to China's territorial and economic claims, and to demanding action or inaction by businesses related to Taiwan, Hong Kong, Tibet, and the ongoing human rights abuses in Xinjiang. The Chinese government has become increasingly assertive in its demands within and outside of its borders. Their mandates related to extraterritorial censorship is particularly troubling. The Chinese government's response to a message of solidarity for Hong Kong by the general manager of the Houston Rockets, for one example, brings to light the lengths the government will go to censor speech, no matter where in the world it occurs. The intended message sent by Beijing's disproportional response is clear. The Chinese government can exert command and control over any enterprise operating in China, public or private. Simply stated, the Chinese government is using its market power to stifle speech of our firms and speech of our people. These actions are inconsistent with our principles, inconsistent with our values, those of our allies. The introduction of a corporate social credit system takes this activity to a new level. The actions undertaken by the Chinese government are clearly restrictive and discriminatory. They are insidious and counter to the necessary conditions of a fair global economic system. Since this hearing was originally scheduled, I should say, in March, we've seen all too clearly the cost of relying on China, a non-market economy, for production of our nation's critical capabilities, whether that is personal protective equipment or otherwise. I recently introduced the Market Economy Sourcing Act, which will begin to right-size supply chains toward the United States and other market-oriented countries. But this is but one measure that must be adopted to refocus our trade rules in the global economic system. If we hope to sustain market-oriented principles for the next, say, 100 years, we must take action now to ensure competition and market principles are not simply words in a textbook, but rather infused into our system of government and governance. When it comes to trade, we must be responsive and creative to address challenges and harness opportunities. There is no doubt Congress, citizens, and businesses must support and defend the economic security of the United States of America. I look forward to hearing today from our witnesses and discussing potential responses, including the required disclosure of these types of requests to the appropriate federal entities and trade rules that prevent free riding from non-market economy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Casey. Now I'd like to take a few minutes to introduce our witnesses, and we look forward to hearing from all of you today. I ask all witnesses summarize your written testimony and try to abide by the 5-minute rule. We'll come back and ask more questions. All of your written statements will be made part of the record without any objection. Our first witness is Mr. Richard Gere. He is chairman of the International Campaign for Tibet, headquartered in Washington, D.C. Of course, Mr. Gere is an internationally known actor, social activist, and philanthropist who's worked for more than 25 years to advocate for human rights of the Tibetan people and preserve the Tibetan culture. He's also co-founder of Tibet House US and creator of the Gere Foundation. He has co-sponsored 5 historic visits to the United States by the Dalai Lama. And Mr. Gere, I understand you had a recent addition to your family. Congratulations on your new son. Thank you for being here. Next, I'd like to welcome Nigel Khoury, Associate Director for Trade Policy for the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation here in D.C. Mr. Khoury is an expert on data and digital trade issues in the global economy. He spent 8 years working for Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, which included positions covering global economic and trade issues among G20 countries and at the World Trade Organization. He's also held diplomatic postings in Malaysia and Afghanistan. Third, I'd like to welcome Beth Baltzan, a fellow in the Open Markets Institute here in D.C. Ms. Baltzan currently focuses on the impact of monopoly power on trade and its consequences for national security. She previously served as Democratic counsel for the House Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee. She spent 6 years as an Associate General Counsel at the United States Trade Representative, where she participated in trade negotiations and litigated trade disputes. Ms. Baltzan has spent 3 years detailed to the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. And finally, I'd like to welcome Mr. Cleet Willems, who is a partner at Aiken Gump, Strauss, Hauer, and Feld here in Washington, D.C. Mr. Willems currently advises a variety of clients on international economic law and policy matters. Before he joined the firm, Mr. Willems served as at the White House as Deputy Assistant to the President for International Economics. He's represented the United States as a key negotiator with foreign governments and has litigated more than 30 WTO disputes. Mr. Willems worked here on Capitol Hill on the House Budget Committee and for the former Speaker, Paul Ryan. Thank you very much for being here, Mr. Willems and all of our witnesses. And Mr. Geer, if you can, if you're there, please proceed with your opening statement.
I'm here somewhere.
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, I mean, this is all a bit bizarre. I certainly prefer this face to face, but let's engage each other anyhow. Chairman Cornyn, Ranking Member Casey, members of the committee, thank you so much for your introduction and inviting me to testify. It's been 35 years since I first testified in Congress, and that was on behalf of our Central American brothers and sisters. And then, of course, on Tibet for the last 30 years or so. Tibet has certainly been my compass that has helped me navigate through the world, and certainly through Washington and probably through all of my life. This is the first time I've testified before the Senate since I last met with one of your greatest colleagues, John McCain. He was a good man. He was a good friend. He was a good friend of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and of the Tibetan people. He certainly was the best of us. And like John McCain and many of you, I'm sure, I hope that our government can deliver at its best, not only for the American people, but for the millions of people all over the world who look to us, look to the United States and its democracy and its freedoms and its openness as a source of inspiration and refuge while they live under oppression and violence. American leadership is at its best when it sets its view beyond the horizon and looks with balanced confidence at the challenges and the opportunities that lie ahead. But the rise of China in the world today is not something beyond our horizon. It's right here. It's right in front of us. It's in our face and affects our daily lives, our workplaces, our freedoms, our privacy, our health. Obviously, we're finding out. Our elections. And it will certainly shape the future of our world. After looking at the committee's work on the Chinese government's plan since 1949 to replace the U.S. on the world stage and advance the Communist Party's authoritarian model everywhere in the world, I'm happy to offer my experience to this existentially important conversation. The conversation about the future of our relationship with the Chinese is crucial, not only to the U.S., and frankly, we've been tragically naive under both Republican and Democratic administrations, but is equally crucial for our democratic allies. I've been involved in supporting the Tibetan people and the vision of His Holiness the Dalai Lama for peaceful coexistence with the Chinese government for almost 40 years now. When it comes to China, Tibet supporters have been in for the long haul, let's say. We knew that what was happening in Tibet would not stop there, and that China's authoritarianism would expand well beyond Tibet, as now we see in Xinjiang, now especially in Hong Kong and beyond China's borders. Now, clearly, we have no quarrel with the Chinese people. They're wonderful people. They're the same as us. We wish the Chinese people to enjoy development and quality of life improvements and opportunities and joy and happiness for their families and for their children. But what I fear is the Chinese Communist Party's model of development that is predicated on control, dominance, and violence. Chinese leaders have often quoted an old Chinese proverb in private: Wai ru ne fa. On the outside, be benevolent. On the inside, be ruthless. I recall vividly a time in the 90s when a very strong bipartisan coalition of members of Congress called on the White House many times to condition China's most favored nation status on clear criteria that would protect the rule of law and human rights. That coalition, unfortunately, was defeated by powerful interests with short-sighted financial goals and a very naive understanding of China's 100-year plan, which they're probably 50 years ahead of already. Conventional wisdom was that by opening our markets to China, this would somehow and by itself produce meaningful political and social reforms. As we now know, the opposite is proven to be true, with more restrictions imposed: Communist Party control of religion, mass incarceration, crackdowns on all forms of dissent, including concealing critical information about the spread of the coronavirus. We also see the Chinese government using economic policies to prey on weaker countries through the extremely dangerous Belt and Road Initiative, their long-term plan to control natural resources, supply chains, trade, ports, and sea lanes. The point I'm trying to make here is that the environmental, human rights, and worker rights reforms we advocated for then would have also protected the larger economic interests of the US and our allies now. Let me give an example. The US opened its doors to Chinese products, Chinese investments, and various forms of Chinese cultural influence, including state media. We've even allowed state-sponsored Confucius institutes to gain a foothold in our universities, and Chinese companies like Khoury to spend large sums of money to lobby the US and enter the US markets. But as you also know, China does not reciprocate. Access to Chinese market is limited. They do not allow American media to broadcast in China. This lack of reciprocity, fueled by an Orwellian system of state censorship and that powerfully restricts the Chinese people's access to information, and American and foreign media companies' access to one of the world's largest media markets. In fact, China has repeatedly insisted that US tech companies accept strict censorship to gain access to its 1.4 billion people. Another example is freedom of movement. Americans have a strong interest and appreciation for the Tibetan people, for the unique Buddhist culture, and their fragile, very beautiful land. It's the roof of our world. It's the third pole, and it is the greatest source of the world's fresh water. But here's what happens in Tibet. The Chinese government highly restricts access to Tibet for Americans, including journalists and politicians, like no other areas of China, while Chinese citizens face no such limitations when they visit the US. They go where they want. Now, Congress recently took action and passed the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act. This is a good, very rational and systematic response, and we hope the State Department will implement it soon, as required by law now. As an actor, which is why I'm here, I think, I know you're interested in my experience in the entertainment industry and growing Chinese influence there. Well, I can't say that my speaking out for human rights in China has directly affected my career. I'm probably an unusual case, and we can talk about that more in the Q&A session. There's no doubt that the combination of Chinese censorship, coupled with American film studios' desire to access China's market, can lead to self-censorship and to avoiding social issues that great American films once addressed. Imagine Marty Scorsese's Kundun, about the life of the Dalai Lama, or my own film, Red Corner, which is highly critical of the Chinese legal system. Imagine them being made today. Wouldn't happen. As I conclude my remarks, I'd like to call your attention to two bills in the Senate. The first is sponsored by Senators Cardin, Casey, Cornyn, Rubio, and Wyden, and already passed the House with overwhelming support. The Tibet Policy and Support Act strengthens U.S. policy in Tibet while addressing one key and overriding issue, the selection of the next Dalai Lama. This can't be allowed to be controlled by the Communist Party, but only by Tibetan Buddhists. I'm sure that you support this basic principle, and I ask you to co-sponsor this bill and raise it with the Senate leadership for swift passage by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Now, the second bill is the Mongolian Third Neighbor Trade Act, introduced by Senators Sullivan and Cardin, and co-sponsored by Ranking Member Wyden and Majority Whip Thune. This bill would grant a democratic and independent Mongolia better access to U.S. market for cashmere products manufactured in Mongolia. We can go into this later. Mongolia is under extraordinary pressure and threat from China right now. This will greatly benefit Mongolia, create jobs for Mongolian women, and reinforce democratic institutions. It's a concrete way to strengthen democracy at a most critical time in the Indo-Pacific, and will help Mongolia remain independent. I call on the Senate to pass this bill as well as soon as possible. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to the questions.
Thank you for joining us. We'll hear the other opening statements and come back for some questions. Mr. Khoury.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Senators. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to testify on the use of censorship as a non-tariff barrier to trade. Let me start by saying that it's important to acknowledge that China uses censorship as a disguised tool for protectionism. Let me start by saying that it's important to acknowledge that China uses censorship as a disguised tool for protectionism. And censorship in the Chinese context means overly broad and discriminatory control over digital content, distribution platforms, infrastructure, and the firms involved. And this disguised protectionism has already cost the US economy so dearly, but this cost will only rise if China is able to export its model of digital governance to other markets around the world. The United States needs a stronger strategy to push back on the direct trade impact of censorship in China, but also to prevent it from moving to other markets. Stakes are high. If we fail to act, the US could lose its edge in the global digital economy. And this is especially the case given censorship, along with other disputes over internet policy, are part of a broader troubling rise of so-called digital sovereignty. And while not alone, China is the world's leader in using overly broad and restrictive and discriminatory rules around content it deems illegal. China is advocating for its own model, but other countries are also attracted to it. And they're drawn to it for political reasons because it provides them with control, but it also provides them with a protectionist tool because they like the economic impact. And while censorship is not the only restrictive tool that China has used, it is a central one that has led to a generation of Chinese internet consumers having an internet experience that is completely different to most people in most countries around the world. And it is known that China uses the Great Firewall to block access to thousands of foreign websites, which is obviously a clear barrier to market access. But it's only one tool of many. It is less known that censorship is also a key factor that leads to US firms from being prohibited from operating in key internet service sectors, in how it plays a part in the opaque, discriminatory and restrictive content review process for video games, movies and TVs. And it's also a key factor that limits or restricts their ability to connect to the global internet, which essentially renders their ability to use cross-border, to access, use or develop software on a cross-border basis. Now, while the primary motivation for censorship in China is regime stability, it gets the economic benefit. And the economic benefit to China and the cost to the United States is already significant. in that over the last 20 years, a host of US industries and firms have lost hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue. And while it's hard to calculate an exact cost, the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation conservatively estimates that, for example, that Google, which withdrew from the Chinese market in 2010, has lost in excess of $32 billion just over a 5-year period from 2013 to 2019. In contrast, Amazon and Microsoft's cloud services, which are also severely restricted in China, are estimated to have lost over $1.6 billion just over a 2-year period from 2017 to 2018. And why should we care about this? Because this lost revenue of billions of dollars would otherwise have supported innovation and employment here in the United States. Now, some US policymakers want to exacerbate the impact of censorship in China by calling for US firms to either leave China or stay out of China because they believe it's immoral to do business there. Now, but the fact is that with or without US firms, China's internet will remain censored. It's been essentially censored since they first connected to the internet. But there should be no doubt that it is in America's economic and security interests that as many American firms as possible sell goods and services into the Chinese market. Every dollar's worth of digital and physical exports is a dollar that Chinese firms don't earn. And it's a dollar that US firms can otherwise use to reinvest in research and development and to support economic and employment opportunities here in the United States. It's also important to recognise that human rights and trade are not mutually exclusive. The United States government should still obviously lead the charge around the world in advocating for human rights and democracy, both in China and elsewhere, but it should also be able to develop, I suppose, a more nuanced, detailed understanding of how it's playing out and developing a countering strategy to how China has deployed censorship in the way it has and to ensure that it doesn't spread any further. As a consequence, we recommend to Congress that it ask the US International Trade Commission for a detailed study into the impact of censorship. And this study could form the basis for new rules for USTR to use in future trade agreements and also to be used by the Department of Commerce. But it could also form the basis for a more holistic global digital economy strategy that is needed to counteract China's effort to advocate for its own model, because there's a fierce debate underway at the moment over which direction countries should go, which approach they should take, and China's is obviously based on censorship and protectionism. Again, I thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Ms. Balson?
Thank you so much, Senator. My name is Beth Balson, and I'm a fellow at the Open Markets Institute. I've been a trade lawyer for nearly 25 years. As Senator Cornyn noted, I've worked at USTR, the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, and the House Ways and Means Committee. All of these experiences inform my testimony today. In 1989, Francis Fukuyama published an influential article called The End of History. He argued that the imminent dissolution of the Soviet Union reflected the triumph of economic and political liberalism, and that economic liberalism would pave the way for political liberalism globally. This view permeated the zeitgeist when we designed the WTO and when we let China into it. Developments in China have shattered that theory. Rather than democratizing as a result of its integration into the global economy, the Chinese Communist Party has weaponized that integration, using its economic leverage to quash the rights of foreign citizens in their home countries. Economic liberalism has become a vector for political illiberalism. Fukuyama has recognized his mistake, going so far as to identify Chinese state capitalism as the most salient ideological threat to democracy. When we look at the actual rules of globalization, we see how this came to pass. In designing the rules in the 90s, we focused on liberalizing capital flows, believing that a laissez-faire model would produce ideal economic and political outcomes. We didn't guard against a government that would exploit that system with a fundamentally anti-competitive, zero-sum strategy. It is that anti-competitive strategy, not natural comparative advantage, that has led us to be economically dependent on an authoritarian regime. It's wrong to say we couldn't have seen this coming. The founders of the multilateral trading system foretold this outcome and sought to prevent it. They designed a regime grounded in fair competition, Cheating through currency manipulation, labor rights suppression, or monopolistic behavior was prohibited. They presciently warned that without these rules, state trading governments, uber monopolists, would destroy free enterprise and democracy. These rules were memorialized in the Havana Charter, signed in 1948 by over 50 countries, but it never entered into force. It's popular lore that an isolationist Congress rejected it, but that's not accurate. The Charter failed because the American business community rejected it. We managed to forestall the immediate threat to democracy and free enterprise by keeping the Soviet Union out of the GATT. But we did allow the PRC, a modern state trading government, into the WTO, and the prophecy now seems to be coming true. It's not too late to mitigate the risk. Addressing the CCP's ability to interfere in our civil liberties requires us to reduce its economic leverage over us. I offer 5 recommendations. First, we must address our supply chain dependency. So much has changed since early March when this hearing was first scheduled. People now understand in very real terms what it means to have a supply chain dependency problem on China. Fortunately, for the first time since the 70s, the United States is having a conversation about strategic industrial policy. We need to identify critical sectors, map out supply chains, and ensure we have diverse sources not just of finished goods, but of components as well. Second, we must recognize that unless we reform the systemic global trading incentives, it will be difficult for us to sustain supply chain diversification. As long as the rules tolerate anti-competitive inducements to offshore, we must anticipate that any newly rebuilt supply chains will eventually end up back where they started. Therefore, we need the right slate of reforms at the WTO. The narrow focus on subsidies is grossly insufficient to deal with the much more structural problem of the CCP's anti-competitive approach to trade. Third, and related to the question of sustaining supply chain diversification, we must keep an open mind about tariffs. Tariffs can be a useful tool for driving behavior. The United States has the lowest bound rate at the WTO. That low rate, coupled with anti-competitive CCP behavior, has made it particularly lucrative to offshore American production and export it back. Until we've achieved global reform, we must consider tariffs to be one way of incentivizing the sourcing we want. Fourth, we should work with our allies, but be realistic. Many of our allies simply do not yet see the CCP as a threat to economic and political freedom. However, supply chain diversification is one area where we can cooperate with countries that share our values. Fifth, we must accept that true market access in China is illusory. The CCP will give us exactly as much market access as they want to. The more we telegraph that we believe unfettered market access is possible, the more leverage they have over us. Being a market access demandeur puts us in a position of weakness and increases their ability to interfere with our civil liberties. Thank you for the opportunity to present these views.
Thank you very much. Mr. Willems.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify today. China is expanding its use of censorship to promote national interests with adverse consequences around the globe. This has been driven home for us by the suppression of information on the coronavirus and the impact that this has had in the United States. While censorship is just one of the many tools that is used to promote the party's interest, and we've talked about others already today, it is something that has not been prioritized in policymaking, including the Phase 1 negotiations that I was a part of while I was in the administration, and therefore it is ripe by further exploration and action. China's censorship activities manifest themselves in many ways. One primary example is the Great Firewall, which restricts free speech through website blocking and filtering. According to USTR, China currently blocks over 10,000 websites, and as I've been getting ready for this hearing, I've seen other estimates that put that number closer to 20 or even 30,000. China also controls domestic news outlets and directs them to avoid unfavorable stories on issues related to the economy and, of course, the coronavirus itself. China's indirect efforts to censor speech are equally troubling. During last year's NBA Twitter controversy, China retaliated against a single tweet by a single individual with a single team by prohibiting the broadcast of all games of all teams in China, which was a clear effort to intimidate those abroad who intended to speak out and whoever wanted to do business in China. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. China's social credit scoring system will enable its regulators to comprehensively monitor and influence behavior in real time. Overall, China's policies enable it to suppress disfavored views, spread propaganda, and promote a business environment where only its companies can compete. China has also been encouraging other repressive regimes to adopt similar policies and has yet to back down in the face of U.S. pressure. After the State Department classified Chinese news outlets as foreign agents, China responded by expelling journalists from Beijing. And I find it particularly ironic that China's wolf warrior diplomats have taken to Twitter to influence global opinion on a site that is totally banned in China. At the WTO, the U.S. could seek to challenge China's restrictions on foreign internet service providers under the service agreement, which bans prohibitions on market access and discrimination. However, these rules were drafted before the internet age, and they're not particularly specific when it comes to censorship, which could lead to uncertainty. China could also try to avail itself of certain exceptions, such as public morals or national security. I believe that the U.S., on balance, has a strong case, but given the time and resources that it would take to bring a dispute and some of the uncertainty I mentioned, I think it's better to move in a different direction. So how should we deal with this issue? Let me give you a couple ideas at the outset. First, we must consistently highlight China's nefarious policies and use the full power of government to seek change. Governments are better positioned than companies to push back against this behavior, and we should not expect our companies to do this alone, and we can't even always expect them to do what we think is the right thing on their own. They need the government behind them. Second, we must work with key allies to do the same. China will find it much more difficult to stir up anti-U.S. sentiment and excuse its behavior if others stand by our side. But those others must not hedge their bets, and they must not send the wrong signal to China by adopting similar policies. The EU's digital sovereignty agenda and the discussion of the European firewall is a case in point. Third, I'd apply the same advice to us. As we seek to counter the threat that is posed by China, we must be careful not to adopt the same policies that we are condemning, policies that stifle free speech or increase market access barriers. This will backfire economically, and it will cause us to lose the moral high ground that's so important to building an effective international coalition. Fourth, we should pursue a broad WTO reform agenda with explicit rules on censorship, forced technology transfer, subsidies, intellectual property theft, and I think some of the ideas that Beth raised as well are worth considering. We should require China to take on the same obligations as the United States and fix the dispute settlement system. The WTO is falling short of its objectives, no doubt, but abandoning the system that we, not China, helped create would be a tragic mistake. China would like nothing more than to see the U.S.-created system collapse. Fifth, we should negotiate a broader range of trade agreements with strong censorship provisions. This includes a revamped U.S.-EU-Japan trilateral, add-on digital trade chapters with existing FTA partners like Australia, a new Taiwan FTA, and a renegotiated TPP. Putting politics aside, the TPP provides a great opportunity to encircle China with policies that stand in contrast to its economic model. There are legitimate concerns about it, but it should be reformed, just like NAFTA, which we're going to bring into force tomorrow, the new USMCA. Let's do the same thing on TPP. Sixth, we must pass new laws to protect U.S. companies so they can safely access a market of over 1 billion consumers. Ideas like protecting employees for being terminated for voicing opinions about foreign government, prohibiting U.S. companies from complying with censorship requests, and disclosing pressure received from the Chinese government all deserve debate. Finally, we must not draw a false equivalence between the Chinese government and its people. Many good Chinese citizens are suffering with their voices muffled by the same policies I've just been describing. A commentary that was briefly posted online in China earlier this year, before it was deleted by the censorship police, stated, "The openness of information is the best vaccine. Blocked ears and eyes are also a contagious disease, and no one can escape." Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll proceed with a round of 5 minutes per senator of questions. And Mr. Gear, let me start with you, if I may. Your courage in confronting the Chinese Communist Party for its methods and tactics of censoring, retaliating, and punishing those with whom it disagrees is commendable, and I thank you for that. As China's economy has grown, though, we've seen more self-censorship. There's the censorship that can be imposed directly by the government, but there's also the practice of self-censorship by companies and individuals that want to do business in China. Can you describe how Chinese practices and their operate and the magnitude it's changed in parallel with the growth that it has experienced?
Yeah, well, in my experience, certainly in the government diplomatic world, I've seen over the last 40 years, China is not shy about letting everyone know that they don't like the Dalai Lama to be treated well and the Tibetans to be treated well. The three T's that they freak out about is Tiananmen Square, Tibet, and Taiwan. And certainly they do call everyone, local, state, national, federal, all over the world, if any of those issues do come up. But I've seen it over the last 30 or 40 years that countries and diplomats do self-censor now, that they take it upon themselves not to put themselves in a position where they're going to be reprimanded by the Chinese, or that they're going to lack some kind of economic access. Norway went through a horrible period when Liu Xiaobo was giving the Nobel Prize. They were cut out completely from trade with China. Moving on to movies, I see the same thing happening over these last years. As I said before, certainly you're not going to see any film that's made by a studio that is critical of China because of investment, of money coming in from China invested in U.S. films. But let me go back a little bit and understand how the film system works in China. There are only 34 international films that are allowed to be shown a year in China. And 12 of those, 1/3 of those, has to be an IMAX film or a 3D film at minimum. So what they want is these high-profile tentpole movies, they're called, digital CGI films, the Marvel movies, etc., which are consumed at a very high level in China, and entrepreneurs can make a lot of money. The two biggest distributing companies in China are state-owned. The film industry is owned by the state in China. So, of course, there's a lot of self-censorship. What would have been a villain, maybe a Chinese villain, is now a North Korean villain in a movie. I mean, some of it is quite silly. There was a movie, high-profile movie, where I think it was Tom Cruise was walking through Shanghai and there was some underwear on a clothesline. The censor objected to that because it made Shanghai look like a less developed city, and it was removed. Christopher Robin was not allowed to be screened in China because there was some amusement that Winnie the Pooh looked like Xi Jinping, and it was refused entry into China. Mm-hmm. But yes, I see this in studios, and it comes up even recently with me. There was a script, quite a good script, that takes place partly in China, and the producers of it at first balked at the idea of me being in the film. And then they were talked to, and actually they're supporters of the Dalai Lama in Tibet. And they took a deep breath and said, no, we're going to make the moral decision here. So we are talking about making that film. Of course, we'll never be able to shoot it in Shanghai. I'm not allowed to go to China. I don't even know now if I'd be allowed in Hong Kong. I asked point blank to very well-known actress, friends of mine, Chinese actresses, if I could work with them. And they said, absolutely not. Their careers would be over in China. They'd never be allowed to work again. I've had other circumstances with very talented Chinese directors that one was in tears with me, having to call me up and say that he couldn't work with me, that his career would be over and his family could not travel. So, I mean, this is personal to a lot of people. My own career, I can't say has suffered at all because I don't make CGI kind of films my films wouldn't naturally be shown in China anyhow, except kind of underground and on the black market. I know the film that I made, Red Corner, many years ago, of course, we couldn't shoot it in Asia. We couldn't even get insurance because of me and the threat from the Communist Party. But when it was shown, I did go to Hong Kong after that. And although it wasn't officially shown in China, as I was going up the elevator in the hotel there, the elevator operator looked up at the camera that was watching us in the elevator. And as I passed him at my floor, he said, "Thank you for Red Corner."
Well, there is that ubiquitous technical surveillance in a police state that by which
Well, we know that the budget for surveillance in China is larger than the military budget.
Thank you very much. Senator Casey, do you have some questions? Senator Casey?
It looks like he's having some technical.
Understand we got a little technology issue. Let me turn to Senator Cassidy, if he's available.
Chairman, thanks very much.
Oh, there he is. Thank you. Go ahead, Senator Casey.
Mr. Chairman, thanks very much. I want to thank you for the hearing. I'll start with Mr. Gear and then go to Ms. Balsan. Mr. Gear, I want to first note for the record, because some other members of the Senate may not know this, but you've got strong Pennsylvania roots personally and in your family, both your parents, and I know that we want to note that for the record, and we appreciate that. I know that we always are welcoming people back if they want to move back. But I want to thank you for that. And I also want to thank you today for the great work that you've done calling attention to these issues over now decades in a manner that sometimes is not the kind of sustained effort that those of us in Washington undertake. There has to be a lot more focus than we've brought to bear on these issues that relate to China, and you've been sounding the alarm for years. I wanted to start with your observations with regard to both the tactics and the strategy employed by the Chinese government, especially over the last decade, to compel or to elicit actions from individuals or companies or, in some cases, governments. So I guess a two-part question: your observations of both tactics and strategies employed by the Chinese government, and secondly, what's your advice for both firms here in the United States as well as the Congress?
Am I on now? Do you hear me? Hello? Yeah, you do.
Yep.
Well, thank you for your kind words. And I have to say, yes, my mother and father both came from Susquehanna County, Brooklyn, Pennsylvania, which I don't think is any larger today than it was in the 20s when they were born. The farming community, dairy farms. My father grew up milking cows by hand early on. So I still have family there and consider that maybe my spiritual home. I think the big overriding thing from my point of view is that we have to understand China's playing the long game. They've been playing the long game. They do have a 100-year plan, and they are way ahead. They were very clever. They realized they were coming from a very weak position, and they decided that they would be the cheapest place in the world to make products. And this was well thought out from their side. They weren't looking to make profits. What they were looking to do was own the markets, which they do at this point. We get our medicines from China. We get most of our manufactured goods from China. We get almost everything you would buy in a store made in China. They own us in many ways. And certainly that to them is controlling a world, the world that we have bought into, which is one of who's going to make the most money. And we've made some huge mistakes along the line, very short-sighted, very naive. They're much smarter than us. They're much more patient than us. They creep into power as we back off, as we pivot away from Asia and we leave a vacuum, they fill it immediately. When we back off in the environmental world, they fill it in immediately. When we break up our alliances, they come in immediately. They're making alliances with Italy right now. The Belt and Road is now ensconced in Italy. It should be the American Belt and Road. It's the Chinese Belt and Road. Again, it's long-term thinking, and especially now that they've made Xi Jinping emperor for life, this 100-year plan will be continuous. As we change administrations, we change focus of what we're doing, how we're thinking, how we approach the world, there are spaces and vacuums that are created, and the Chinese have taken them every single time. They creep into every open space. And I've talked to leaders all over Europe, all over Central America and Asia. I said, please do not take a loan to build an airport or a port from the Chinese, because they will take that airport, they will take that railroad, they will take that port away. We've seen it in Sri Lanka, and we're going to see it in Italy. So I think the strategy for us is to step back and understand this long-term strategy for world dominance that is coming from the Chinese Communist Party. And part of it is talking to each other, having these alliances, relying on TPP, relying on real honest relationships with the EU. This is a world of strong alliances, can confront what the Chinese are doing and win.
Senator Casey,
I know, Mr. Chairman,
I know you had a question for Ms.
supposed to
Balson.
be out of time. Maybe I'll go in the second round.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Dr. Cassidy, Senator Cassidy.
Thank you. Mr. Gary, you just said something creeping. By the way, thank you all for testifying. Incredibly important hearing. I thank you very much. And Mr. Gary, you just mentioned creep into power. I kind of like that as a kind of, this is how, creep into the vacuum. But I'm trying to ask myself, how do we stop it? Now, Ms. Baltzan, I am struck by your testimony because it actually links their ability, the Chinese ability to do digital censorship to the economic power that they are accruing. And it suggests that I like, that whole exchange that you had in your thing about if you have, free trade by itself doesn't necessarily make things happen. It has to be otherwise with guardrails. I say that because I was recently told by Central American countries that the workers' rights, the human rights, and the environmental requirements we place upon them in order to conduct trade has increased their cost of production and put them at a competitive disadvantage for a company looking for a low-cost place to produce. Therefore, they go to China, which does not have the workers' protections, to say the least, the environmental protections, et cetera. And so it kind of slides that way, which, if you will, works against our interests in multiple fashions. Do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, is that to me? Is that to, who's it to?
Ms. Baltzan. Am I pronouncing your name correctly, ma'am?
You did.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yes, I think this is something that we see with Mexico as well. I think the answer to stopping this race to the bottom, which is fundamentally based on anti-competitiveness, these are anti-competitive bases for trade, is to incorporate these standards at the WTO. And it's very surprising to me that in light not only of these issues in Central America and Mexico and other places, but in light of Tazreen, the fire at Tazreen in Bangladesh, the collapse of Rana Plaza in Bangladesh, it surprises me that labor issues and environmental issues and this race to the bottom are not part of the WTO reform package. I did point out in my testimony that there were labor rules in the Havana Charter, which was supposed to be the governing document for the global trading system going back to 1948. If China were actually required to adhere to those rules like everyone else, then you would have the opportunity to mitigate the race to the bottom that we're seeing.
But let me ask you for a second, if you will, if we are going, you mentioned the problem with our supply chains going through China, but they are going to be the lower cost as long as they are willing to sacrifice international environmental standards, labor rules, human rights, etc. Granted, Vietnam might be lower cost in some places based upon labor, but nonetheless, even that is a further race to the bottom. If we're talking about bringing supply chains back to more secure places and decreasing the economic growth of China by which they can coerce people into accepting their censorship, we really have to kind of take into accommodation that what you're describing now. Is that kind of the essence of, I'm adding to it, but would you agree with that which I said?
I think that's right. I think we need a race to the top, not a race to the bottom. And I think, labor is part of Section 301, so that could be on the table, not just IP, but Section 301 on labor with respect to our negotiations with China as well. Why not?
Okay. That's very helpful. I'm sorry, I don't have my notes in front of me. I'm not used to working remotely. The gentleman who spoke at the very end, I think you spoke of kind of a need to confront this digital and censorship across the globe. But how does tell me again how the U.S. is to do that? How do we get, for example, Italy to not accept censorship when according to Mr. Guerra, Hollywood is effectively accepting censorship?
So thank you for the question. What I was referring to in general was that I think we need a much more robust negotiating agenda with a range of potential allies that is more explicit on this censorship question. We've made some progress in some trade agreements, the USMCA, the Japan Digital Trade Agreement, where we talk about non-discrimination and the free flow of information across borders. But I think we can go much further and much deeper and much more explicit on censorship. And I think that doing so would actually help address some of the concerns that I have about a WTO dispute and some of the uncertainty that could be put into place by some of China's counterarguments. So I think a much broader trade negotiating agenda is the way to go. The other thing, though, on Italy that I think Mr. Geer was referring to was that Italy had basically signed up for some Belt and Road money. It happened about 2 years ago while I was in the administration, and I personally was involved in calling Italy and trying to get them to stop. The problem was, they were in an economic crisis. They wanted infrastructure, and China was offering it cheaply. It's a huge problem. We need to have an American alternative. We've tried to do that with the International Development Finance Corporation. I think it's a very helpful addition to the U.S. toolkit. But I'd like to see us put even more money at that effort and see us link up with other trading partners and then have international standards on development financing, standards about transparency and accountability, standards that we meet, that Europe meets, but that China cannot. That's another area I'd like to go.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Senator Menendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and thank you to all of our witnesses. The movie industry's thirst for profits and for access to China's huge audiences makes it uniquely susceptible in many ways to the sort of self-censorship that the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, likes to encourage others to impose on themselves. 1/4 of Aquaman's global box office came from China. Disney earned $600 million off of Avengers Endgame in China. That's a lot of leverage. And the People's Republic of China is very clear that when it comes to movies, it wants products that are not only entertaining, but that align with the party's worldview. So, Mr. Geer, can films that are not CCP propaganda pieces really get access to China? Given the role of China in the global box office, what effect is China having on the movie industry overall?
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't think it's as dark as you were describing in this moment. I mean, there certainly are benign movies that are completely apolitical that have access. Those movies that you brought up are pure entertainments and politically neutral. I think those will never have a problem having access to 1.4 billion Chinese viewers. But I do think that challenging films, along the lines of All the President's Men or Red Corner that I made, highly unlikely that these kind of films are going to be supported by Chinese investors. And especially if they say in advance, which they often do, that there's no way that that film will have access to the Chinese people.
Yeah. How about, but even in the case of, and I get that those are rather benign, but even in the case of Top Gun Maverick, whose producers removed references to the Japanese and Taiwanese flags at the request of a Chinese investor, China still has a lot of power to dictate their preferences. Isn't that fair to say?
It's very fair to say, but also it's very illustrative of their weakness. I mean, how silly is that? How completely ridiculous. It's the way that they're hypersensitive about the Dalai Lama, the kindest, most generous man on the planet, who's consumed and saturated with love and compassion and forgiveness. The mere mention of his name makes them crazy. The problem is that communist parties everywhere lack legitimacy. And someone like the Dalai Lama, for instance, is legitimate. People love the Dalai Lama for deep and powerful reasons. You don't love the Communist Party. You abide by it because it's powerful and it controls you, but you don't love it. Legitimacy, true legitimacy comes from the heart. And that's really what they're afraid of. It's something that touches the heart, and through the heart, a sense of right and wrong and decency. So I think anything that basically has that would challenge even the idea of a communist party or of totalitarianism or the kind of surveillance state that they have developed there. Anything that challenges that, even in a poetic way, is going to make them crazy.
Yeah. And I agree with you. How small is it of them to be worried about Japanese or Taiwanese flags? But even something as small as that is something that the filmmakers were willing to submit themselves to. And so that's what worries me. And I agree with you on the Dalai Lama. And I so appreciate in my other role in the Foreign Relations Committee what you have done in your long quest to have the recognition and the freedom for the Dalai Lama to do what he does as a spiritual leader of so many. But this is what I'm concerned. We know what the Chinese are and what they do. I'm concerned about their influence over us. I look at the fact that President Xi has declared that every foreign movie to be shown in China must be vetted by the Central Propaganda Department. And depending on the content, the Ministry of State Security, the Ministry of Public Security, the Ethnic Affairs Committee, and the Bureau of Religious Affairs also may be involved. Now, I don't think they're looking at lighting or cinematography or editing. I think they're looking to preempt themselves, and this is a challenge. I wonder, and I say this to the panel, does this influence filmmakers' choices to preempt themselves from offending Chinese censors? What happens if the creative team is unwilling to make the sorts of changes that China wants?
Well, you have different types of movies. And certainly a Top Gun kind of movie that's not an art film festival kind of movie. It's a mass market entertainment. And I don't know that the changing of the flags on his uniform, is a major blow to the soul of the filmmakers. It's not that kind of a film. I'm not worried about those kind of films. I'm worried about the rabbit hole that one goes down at this point. If all of our films become primarily financed by Chinese money, then clearly you're going to see films that are there to glorify the Chinese party in some way. But that's a ways down the rabbit hole. I think still serious filmmakers are going to make the kind of film that they want to make. The commercial movies that you're talking about, they want access to a mass market, and I can't blame them for that. And minor changes along the way, it's hard for me to fault. I'm more concerned about the soul of storytelling and movies and entertainment, which is beyond the kind of Marvel movie kind of movie making. Now, clearly, you're not going to have Chinese villains anymore. That's not going to happen. That's done. It's going to be North Korean. They're all going to be North Korean from now on. But, I always thought they were paper tigers anyhow. That I never felt comfortable with that in any event. But as I mentioned in my original talk, the inability for serious films looking at deeply profoundly at the situation in China will not happen now.
Thank you, Senator.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to make one last comment, if I may,
Sure.
with your indulgence. And I understand, Richard, what you're saying, but sometimes the soul is lost step by step and dollar by dollar.
That's the rabbit hole I'm afraid of, yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you. Thank you to the panelists. I appreciate the conversation today. So let me approach it from this perspective, and let me turn to Hong Kong. American and European companies are receiving pressure from the Chinese government party to endorse the national security law and other CCP actions towards restricting freedom and civil liberties in Hong Kong. We know that. The pressure will almost certainly extend to other issues the CCP deems sensitive. But what we have also seen is the pressure on American companies who want to do business in China and to change some of their, policies, principles, some of their products in response to the pressure on China. So I guess my question to all the panelists is, what can Congress do to support American companies experiencing the CCP government pressure and propaganda? I mean, that's the challenge we have here. I sit on banking and housing as well, and we just had this discussion on how American companies are succumbing to the pressure put on the Chinese government. What do we need to be aware of here in Congress, and what can we do to support our American companies who want to get into that market, but at the same time stay true to our freedoms, our democracy, and who they truly are as a business?
Yeah, I just had one comment here, and it's to bring again the attention of reciprocity, international norms of reciprocity. We have to demand. We've given away way too much, way too much. We didn't have to. The Chinese just they're sitting back in their chairs and going, we got what we wanted again. We got what we wanted again and again. Reciprocity, just the norms of international behavior, access to their markets, access to information. Those are huge things to them, huge. But we can demand that there is reciprocity of movement. No one gets to Xinjiang, no one gets to Tibet. It's impossible. It's easier for a journalist friends of mine told me this, easier to get into North Korea than into Tibet. Reciprocity. The norms of international behavior have to be demanded, and we can't be drunk with those short-term goals of money. Can't, because we've seen what it's done to us over the last 25, 30 years.
I appreciate that. Thank you. But let me ask you. Let me open it up to the panel, because I think, Mr. Khoury, earlier you said that the U.S. should ask the International Trade Commission for a study on China's censorship and protectionism. So we have this study. Then what do we do? It's because we know and let me put it in this perspective. Once we have the study, is there an opportunity to bring in international organizations or other countries, our allies, our friends, to really put pressure here and focus on this reciprocity, or what we should be doing to address the censorship and protectionism?
Yeah, I think the study is a simple first step that sort of sends a clear signal that the United States recognises that this is no longer some minor trade irritant, that this is a part of the strategic calculation with China. And because what we've seen is that countries like my home country of Australia, the United States, Canada, and the European Union, are all somewhere along a spectrum in waking up to what China and the Chinese Communist Party represents to their trade interests, their economic interests, but also their home political interests and values there. And so it sends that clear signal. And then it starts the process of outlining what are the corresponding steps that the United States can take. And that's multifaceted. That's addressing the cases where Chinese Communist Party action is applied extraterritorially outside of China, in the United States, in Australia and elsewhere, documenting those, bringing the transparency to that. It's also setting up the mechanisms to talk with US firms and industries who are in the impossible position of trying to stand up to the Chinese Communist Party to get a better understanding of what exactly is going on, what are they asking for, how are they asking for it, what's the legal basis for it there, because only then does the United States have the information it needs to respond. But also, importantly, I think the study would reflect, and the strategy that it should lead to, was that the United States can't do this alone. It most definitely needs to lead the charge in making the case and pressing back against what China's doing, but the point has passed where the United States can do this on its own. Whether that point was 10 or 15 years ago, it's a matter of fact now that the United States really does need to work with its like-minded, value-sharing partners, especially the European Union, Japan, Australia and others, in providing a collective response, because that's really the best chance we have for affecting change in China and its effect outside of China.
Thank you, Senator Cortez Masto. We'll now turn to Senator Wyden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate all our guests being with us, and as ranking Democrat of the full committee, I take a great interest in this, and good to see you again, Mr. Jerry, as well. Welcome. And I want to ask you all about something John Bolton wrote in his book. Of course, he's the former National Security Advisor, and I'm just going to read it to you. At the opening dinner of the Osaka G20 meeting in June of 2019, with only interpreters present, Xi had explained to Trump why he was basically building concentration camps in Xinjiang. According to our interpreter, Trump said that Xi should go ahead with building the camps, which Trump thought was exactly the right thing to do. The National Security Council's top Asia staffer, Matthew Pottinger, told me that Trump said something very similar during his November 2017 trip to China. So we have very knowledgeable witnesses on this panel, and I would just like to see if any of you believe that encouraging foreign leaders to build detention and forced labor facilities for religious minorities is anything but a repudiation of American values. Does anybody think that that is not the case? That this is a repudiation of American values?
Yeah, I mean, it's I don't know what crazy movie we are in all of a sudden. This is Dr. Strangelove. I can't imagine there's another person in U.S. government or another person, an American citizen, who even remotely would believe what the president said, would feel that same way. The concentration camps are the right way to go. It's appalling.
Anybody want to add to that? I think that pretty much sums it up. It certainly does for me, and our family knows a lot about concentration camps as well. Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Senator Casey, good job. Incredibly important hearing, and I look forward to learning more about all that you have discussed. Thank you.
Mr. Willems, I know that we moved to the next questioner before, and you had your hand up, wanted to make a comment on some of the earlier testimony or questions. Go ahead.
No, thank you very much. And let me just comment quickly on the last two questions. I mean, first, on this question about the Osaka dinner, I was out of the administration by that time, so I have no firsthand knowledge of it. I can tell you, though, while I was in the administration, I did work closely with Matt Pottinger and Ambassador Bolton and others on trying to push back on the policies in Xinjiang. And I think that ultimately, action has been taken there, as it should. What's going on in that region is appalling, and the U.S. and allies around the world need to stand up against it. The comment I also had just wanted to make on the previous question was about what we can do to help our companies. And I do think, in particular, we need to play a robust role at the governmental level. A lot of this conversation has been about, how it's terrible that, we are trying to access China's market because that gives them more leverage. I might flip it another way and say that by having access to China's market, we are getting a lot of money that our companies can then pump into research and development to make sure that they are an innovation leader ahead of China. So another way to put it is that China is subsidizing our innovation. And I think if you look at our semiconductor industry, which you have paid a lot of attention to, they get 30 to 40% of their sales in China. So that's an important source of revenue for them. I think we also need to do our part, like the CHIPS Act. But I think it's important not to only look at this as to what the adverse consequences are of market access, but also to look at the positive ones. But in terms of helping our companies, I like the idea, I mentioned this in my opening, of disclosure, making our companies disclose, when they're pressured by the Chinese government. I think you should do that for forced technology transfer as well. It puts the onus on the U.S. law instead of on the company, and therefore makes it much more difficult for China to retaliate, because the problem is not the U.S. company, the problem is the U.S. government. So bring it to us. We can stand up. A similar thing I would consider is prohibiting U.S. companies from complying with censorship requests, certainly with respect to the activities that they're conducting in our jurisdiction. And what I like about this is it is reciprocal, as Mr. Geer was talking about. And Beth will be familiar with this with her time at the PCAOB. Legislation that you all have been looking at basically would say it's unacceptable for Chinese companies to refuse access to our auditors who want to regulate their financial records. Now, what those companies tell our regulators is we can't do it because of Chinese law. So let's do the same thing. Let's tell our companies they can't comply with censorship because of U.S. law. And that's exactly what China's doing to us, so let's do it back to them. Just as it's unacceptable for them to say we can't access the audits, it's also unacceptable for them to say they should censor our companies. And so let's use a robust response from the U.S. government to help those companies.
Thank you for mentioning the CHIPS Act. This is a major bipartisan effort to bring high-end semiconductor manufacturing back onshore and to reduce, as Ms. Balson pointed out in her testimony, these supply chains of critical technology that, can you imagine if we did not have access to that and we didn't have the capacity to build it here in America? Obviously, that's a huge vulnerability. And the virus has taught us many lessons, most of them painful, but some of them point to a much different path that we have traveled down before. We simply can't continue to depend on China just because it's cheap, especially in some of these very, very sensitive areas. I think Senator Brown is next, if he's with us. Pardon? Well, I understand that he's not able to be with us. So, Mr. Geer, let me just ask you: how much money does the Chinese government invest in Hollywood? Do you have any way of quantifying that?
I'm probably not the person to ask. I was looking through some material last night, and there were some deals in the $250 million range. There were several in the $100 million plus range.
Well, we can run that. We can run those numbers down. Let me ask you this: last year, I was very much involved in the effort to reform the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, but we were focused primarily on foreign investment in technology and startups. As you know, the Chinese government doesn't observe any distinction between the private sector and their military, and in fact, the private sector is compelled to share anything they have that their military wants with them and the Communist Party. But given what you've described about the self-censorship and the influence that China has on the sorts of movies that Hollywood makes, do you think we ought to be looking more broadly beyond just technology at other investments that China is making in the United States that helps facilitate the path they're on?
Well, I think they read us very well, as I said before. The 100-year plan was to step back and really look at the rest of the world. And they saw the trajectory that the U.S. was on. If they could, money was the way. And if they began by creating products that were manufactured the cheapest in the world, as we all know. And that created the situation where they controlled those markets. As we're seeing tragically now with the medicines, they own our pharmaceuticals. Right. This is going to permeate everything in our society as long as money is our prime motivator. It wasn't for them. It's power and control. They gave up the money part of it early on to create control, understanding that that control would pay off decades later. And that's what they're reaping right now. I want to go back to something I think Mr. Khoury said and emphasize it. The turn that this administration made, that the U.S. shall go it alone, has been a huge mistake in terms of China. The only way we can counter China is if the U.S. and the EU, our European friends and allies, true friends and allies, and Japan and India, create a coalition that really understands what the Chinese are trying to do, and that we negotiate with them as a group, as democracies, free market democracies, independent. That's the only way that we're going to make any real change here. I mean, the U.S. government, the U.S. Congress has done extraordinary things, but the U.S. can't do it alone, especially in this situation where it's America first and all those, frankly, kind of naive cliches. We're in a very interconnected world, and let's be interconnected with the best of the world. And that best of the world still exists. Our European brothers and sisters, Japan, India, the great democracies of the world. We can do this together and create the world we want and counter the Chinese Communist Party.
Thank you. Senator Casey, or you, do you have any other questions you'd like to ask?
Mr. Chairman, I hope you can see and hear me.
We can see and hear you.
That's great. Well, I was hoping at least for audio, but thanks so much for the hearing. And I just had one question I wanted to ask earlier to Ms. Baltan about the Havana Charter, which she gave some of the history of, the fact that it was signed by 54 countries but never went into force, and that there was opposition from at the time, from our business community. I guess I'd ask you, in addition to the history and the significance of it, what's still relevant today? And in particular, how it relates to conditions of trade and terms of trade.
Thank you so much for the question, Senator Casey. I think There's been this narrative that the foundation of the global trading system was about tariff liberalization and nothing else. And I think that narrative is false and extremely harmful. And some of the things Mr. Gear was talking about the philosophy we had in the 90s, about the conditions in which we created the WTO and let China in, are directly traceable to that misunderstanding of our own history. If you look at what was motivating the founders of the system, and we're talking about initially FDR and John Maynard Keynes and then those who followed them, these were people who had lived through the Gilded Age. They had seen income inequality, they had seen nationalism, they had seen political instability, they had seen authoritarianism, and more importantly, they had seen how, particularly in Europe, authoritarian governments had been able to deploy concentrated economic power in the form of cartels and trusts to pursue an authoritarian agenda. And they weren't just thinking about Italy and Germany in the past. They were looking ahead to the Soviet Union, and that was communist rather than fascist. But it was the same fundamental problem, which is this relationship between an authoritarian government and concentrated industrial production. And that is why so much of the Havana Charter is about making sure that you're protecting competition itself, because they believed that protecting competition was a way of protecting democracy. And somehow that entire line of thinking has been lost. So let's look at what we're confronting today. Is the Havana Charter relevant today? Well, it's a second Gilded Age. We've again got problems with income inequality, and this goes to the issue with Senator Cassidy. You can't just keep suppressing labor rights and expect not to have authoritarianism and a revolt by the working people. So if we want to deal with these structural issues, then we've got to have a set of rules that promotes competition. We're seeing again a rise in industrial concentration, and then we bring all this to bear and look at what's going on in China, and in my view, we see the emergence of the very thing that the founders of the global trading system were trying to prevent, which is an authoritarian government that is not only able to leverage industrial power to pursue its ends, but it's actually able to use the multilateral trading system to execute that agenda. And I really want to point out something in your opening remarks that's important. This really isn't about publicly owned versus privately owned, and the Havana Charter covers both. I am extremely concerned that we spend a lot of our time talking about state-owned enterprises in China when the pivotal variable isn't who owns what, it is the relationship between those industries and the government.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Casey. Senator Cassidy, do you have another question? I know we're sort of winding down here a little bit, but I want to give everybody who has another question an opportunity. Go ahead, please.
Ms. Bolton, again, I go back to your, thesis. It's their economic power that allows them to exert this censorship data. And so, and again, I find that valid. So it's a little bit far afield from this hearing, but still you've raised it, so I'm going to ask you. I agree. We should not allow people to use arbitrage of environmental laws or of workers' rights or of human rights using slave labor, et cetera, in order to undercut the ability of a worker in the United States, for example. On the other hand, there's a tension there. If we have environmental laws that we really need, and another nation does not, it either would require everybody to have the same environmental laws and the same labor laws, even though obviously conditions in, say, Central America are different than those in the United States. I say that as regards what is the minimum wage, for example. So if we're going to re-examine our trade relationship, I think everybody would agree, I think at least, that if we're going to demand a certain environmental standard for air pollution in the U.S., and Chinese air pollution blows over to the U.S., we should ask for the same environmental standard there. Get that. But going back to wage rates, do you conceive that wage rates would also be, required to have some sort of equivalency, because otherwise our folks would be disadvantaged?
I'm actually very supportive of what is in the new NAFTA. I'm supportive of the rules that have been enforceable in our trade agreements since 2007, which is core labor standards. This isn't about setting a specific prescriptive set of rules that every country must follow without regard to its development level. This is about setting a floor, and that is also what the founders of the system did in the Havana Charter.
Okay, and so if we had that floor as part of a trade agreement with China, that may be a remedy, if you will, knowing that that's easier said than done, but nonetheless, that would be a potential remedy, correct?
Yeah, I would use the WTO and I would use Section 301 to establish that.
Although in your WTO, in your testimony, you point out that since that's a consensus organization, it would be difficult to work through WTO.
I think that's true. I think we should ask for it. I think we should ask for it.
And if we fail there, because undoubtedly we will fail, what was this, the Section 302 and anything else?
I think there have been proposals, not in any concrete terms, but proposals about access to U.S. markets and having essential standards as part of our domestic regime. And I think those are worth considering.
Okay, thank you very much.
Senator Cortez Masto, do you have an additional question? Senator Wyden, do you have any other questions you want to ask? Well, let me just say how much I appreciate it, and I know we all appreciate your testimony here today. And Mr. Geer, for what it's worth, you know, I think we need to sort of get to a place where we recognize that administrations, whether they're Republican or Democrat, can have good ideas and some not so good ideas. I know this administration seems to believe that bilateral trade negotiations are optimal, and I can understand why their argument is that if you do a multilateral trade agreement, you're going to have to give up too much in order to get, but there are benefits, and I think you described one of them, particularly dealing with China. We do need to work with our allies and to confront this challenge. One, because they are in the same situation we're in. They are being eviscerated economically and threatened militarily, and it is important for us to work with people who share our values to counter this incredible, aggressive economic and military threat from China. So let me thank you for raising that point, and I think you'll find a lot of people in Congress who share that view. So with that, let me thank all of you for joining us here today on this very, very important topic. We are going to have a deadline of 2 weeks for additional questions. It may be that senators have some additional written questions they would like to ask, and we'll keep the record open for 2 weeks if the witnesses would be so kind as to respond to those. We would very much appreciate it. And with that, the Subcommittee on International Trade, Customs, and Global Competitiveness stands adjourned. Thanks so much.
Good afternoon. From Washington, D.C., I'm Ashwin Verghese, ICT's Communications Officer, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this live conversation. We just finished watching ICT Chairman Richard Geer testify in the Senate on a subcommittee hearing on censorship as a non-tariff barrier to trade. I hope you had the opportunity to watch, and we should have the recording of the entire hearing available to view soon on our website. But for now, we want to have a conversation with all of you to talk about Richard's testimony and where the ICT community goes from here. To do that, we're joined by ICT President Matteo Mocacci. Matteo, are you there?
Yes, I am.
You are wonderful.
Hello, everybody.
Hey, Matteo, thanks so much for being here. So we will get the conversation started in just a moment, but just one quick reminder for all of you who are watching live. If you'd like to ask a question to Matteo, please email your question to comments@savetibet.org or post your question in the comments section of the live stream on our Facebook page. With that, let's get right into the conversation, Matteo. So we do have some questions coming in by email, but first of all, let me just ask you, like I just said, we just finished watching Richard testify at a Senate subcommittee hearing, and it was a very interesting conversation. Yeah. What are your big takeaways from Richard's testimony and from the hearing as a whole?
Yeah, no, I think it was an extremely important hearing. First of all, I would like to point out also to our viewers that this hearing was held by the Committee on Finance, and it focused on China, and there was a lot of discussion also about censorship, and in particular on the impacts of censorship in Tibet and the blocking of access to Tibet for foreigners, in particular for Americans. But this is an interesting new development, because usually we have seen our chairman testifying before the Foreign Affairs Committee, both in the Senate or in the House, where there are usually discussions connected to foreign policy, human rights, and the rule of law. And this time there was an important connection between the importance of censorship and its effect on the rule of law, on human rights, on freedom of expression, freedom of movement, but at the same time also connecting this to the economic impact that these policies by China are having on the United States in particular, but frankly on the entire world. So we have finally seen something that we have been advocating for a long time, that you cannot de-link human rights and economic prosperity. You cannot really have fair trade. You cannot have good economic prosperity by a country if you don't respect human rights, workers' rights, environmental rights. And so our advocacy for Tibet and for the Tibetan people is to make sure that the Tibetan people can enjoy in China, in Tibet, the same rights that people can enjoy here. And now we have a completely unbalanced world situation where you have countries that apply different systems of values. On one side you have democracy, or you have opportunity for citizens to choose their own government, and on the other side you have this big authoritarian model promoted by China, which is also becoming very prosperous and economically powerful. So I think that's the most important point I wanted to make. And secondly, I think we have heard from our chairman very eloquent words about the importance of making sure that this model of authoritarian development is challenged. And this is coming from someone who has been involved with ICT for almost 30 years. We got our 30th anniversary last year, and he has been a chairman for more than 25 years. And now I think finally people are realizing that what's happening in China is going to have an effect on our society. And so doing advocacy for the Tibetan people is promoting positive change in China. And hearing also many senators like Senator Corning, Senator Casey, Senator Menendez, Senator Wyden, others, talking about the situation in Tibet as something that it's very close to their interests and to their strategic vision for the future of the world and the future of the United States. I think it's very encouraging. So I think that was, very important to see today.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And it was absolutely a very encouraging hearing for all of us who care about Tibet. One other sign of encouraging news. So, as you know, the United States passed the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act in late 2018. It was signed into law by the president. And in addition, recently, 57 parliamentarians from 19 European countries published an op-ed in several newspapers across the continent of Europe, calling on their own governments to pass their own versions of the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act. This is another really promising development. I should give a quick shout out to our colleagues at ICT Europe, who have not only worked extremely hard to make reciprocal access to Tibet an important issue in European governments, but also held their own Tibet Talk earlier today. Tibet Talk is obviously a series that we've been having here in the United States. And we recommend that you check out their discussion. It should be available to view at savetibet.nl/live. Again, that's savetibet.nl/live. So please go there and take a look. So, Matteo, you were a parliamentarian in Italy, and you have a lot of involvement with European politics. Given the recent developments in Europe, do you feel that reciprocal access to Tibet is developing into something that countries are going to begin to expect in their relationships with China and demand from China as they're moving forward?
Yeah, I think so. And actually, even today in the discussion, reciprocity came out many times. Naturally, Richard, put the question to everybody and challenged, the senators and the other panelists on this issue, but also other panelists. They talked about that, and they talked about the imbalance in the determined by the lack of reciprocity between the United States or Europe and China, when China doesn't allow access to the market. And so this is costing, and I just wrote some numbers. Mr. Khoury said that Google lost from 2010 $32 billion in revenue because of the lack of access to the Chinese market. Or, Amazon, only for the last 2 years, they may have lost $1.6 billion because they don't have access to their, to their market. While, Alibaba or other companies, or WeChat or other, Huawei, they're having access to our markets. So this lack of reciprocity is becoming really central to the core interests of all the governments that are dealing with China, because China is no longer a developing country. It's a major country with 1.4 billion people who have a huge market, and they are not allowing others to have access to that. In addition to this lack of access to the market, they also censor. They also avoid, people from speaking their mind. And so this way of, developing an Orwellian system of control, as Richard put it, is really scary, because it is going to have an impact on other countries as well. So this initiative by European members of parliament, it's very, very important, because we have seen also recently the European Union, and in particular also the German presidency, they have come up with some official statements in which they are saying that reciprocity is going to be central in their relationship with China. So now we started here 5 years ago. Nobody was talking about reciprocity at the time when the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act was introduced by Congressman McGovern first, and then by Mr. McGovern and Senator Rubio, and then it was passed into law. And now we are eagerly waiting for the State Department to implement it. And by implementing it, I think it will send a very clear signal that this is serious and reasonable legislation that can be adopted by many other countries. So I frankly think that reciprocity is a word, is a concept, it's a policy that is going to be here to stay. And I think all ICT members should be proud of being part of this movement, which is shaping policy not just for the Tibetan people, but actually is going to benefit also our own societies.
Yeah, it has been really incredible to watch the progress of reciprocity as a concept over the past few years, and we're really pleased with the progress that's been made. I think your answer to that question really segues nicely into one of our first audience questions, actually. And you talked about the lack of access that U.S. businesses have to the Chinese market. So we have a question here from Pema Dondop. And Pamela, thank you for watching, and thank you for your support of ICT. The question is, India recently announced that it was going to ban more than 40 Chinese apps from access to the Indian market. And obviously we have seen escalating border tensions between those two countries, including on the border of Tibet. And so this has become a big issue. So Pema mentioned that India has banned those apps, and as you said, China also does not allow a lot of these U.S. businesses to have access to its market to, allow Chinese users to use its apps. So what about the USA? Is this something that the USA should consider, replicating what India has done, and what should the U.S. do to kind of enforce reciprocity when it comes to business access?
Yeah, I think this is an issue which is, I think, particularly important also for our, Tibetan brothers and sisters, because especially those in India, I think they have been using WeChat, which is a Chinese app, as the only, the best way, the only way to communicate with their relatives, with their families, or with people in Tibet. And even if people know that, it's not a safe app because it's controlled by the Chinese government, so all communications can be censored, can be accessed, and it can be retaliation. But I think even for family communication, it has been useful. So I'm pretty sure that the grounds on which the Indian government has taken this step is based also on national security issues, because unfortunately when the Chinese use this app or they use other software or hardware, and there is a lot of discussion, as everybody knows, about Huawei and their ability to build a 5G network all over the world, and the potentially dangerous risk that they can control the information going through those networks and also have access to very sensitive information. Now, in democracies, people have a right to privacy. So if a manufacturer or someone who's selling a product cannot guarantee that there will be a right to privacy and that the sensible data will not be shared with people who have no right to have access to that, I think it's legitimate for governments to take action. Frankly and personally, I would not use apps or technology which have their servers based in China, including Zoom, frankly. And we have seen cases recently of content related to Tiananmen that was shut down because it was being discussed during a Zoom call. And so that's why we're using a different platform here, for example, and which is Blue Jeans, actually, we can say, and people can check it out because it offers many of the same functions that Zoom does. But I think this is very serious because we live in a world even more now where we need to rely on technology, and unless technology is safe to be used, I think governments should step in and take action. So for the US, I'm sure they're looking into that very, very closely.
Yes, those are some really interesting developments that we need to keep monitoring. And you're right, Blue Jeans has been wonderful for us, so we've been very happy with that. I do want to get back to Richard's testimony. So
Yes.
Throughout his testimony, Richard talked about the link between China's regime of censorship and its lack of reciprocity with the United States and other democratic societies. By this point, I think many ICT members have a pretty good understanding of reciprocal access to Tibet and why it's such an important issue and why it was such an important legislative effort. Can you elaborate on how Chinese censorship deals with lack of reciprocity and what's the connection between the two?
So basically, Richard also made one example. There has been a huge investment by the Chinese government in state media across the world over the last few years. Both the Chinese television, state television, or the Chinese news agencies have now opened shops in dozens of countries, and now they are also broadcasting and distributing their propaganda, because it's state propaganda. This is not a normal, news network which is operating in a different country. With dozens of languages. They are translating their content in dozens of languages. So this is part of the strategy to try to influence public opinion about China. And the way they talk about the situation in China or in Tibet is based on this approach, which is based only on propaganda and on vetting the news that come out of China in a controlled way. So while they do that, so they expand their operations, their media operations worldwide, they do not reciprocate and do not allow foreign media to broadcast in China. So even the New York Times has a Chinese website, is not accessible for Chinese people within China. None of the American networks, CNN or BBC in the UK or others, can broadcast in Chinese in China. And so by doing that, they do not only they increase their influence outside, they limit the influence of different media and free media in their own society, but they also prevent access to a huge market for foreign companies. So as Mr. Khoury was saying today, they also have an economic advantage that comes out of censorship. So that's why it's important to call for reciprocity, because it's in our economic interest. And it's in our, based on our values, because we want to have, same freedom of movement. And so if Chinese people can travel wherever they want in the United States, Americans or Europeans should be allowed to travel to Tibet without restrictions. Why would you not allow that to happen if you are, dealing as equal partners in the world? So I think that's really, really important. But another, I think, series of remarkable statements that came from Richard was about Hollywood today. I mean, what he described first as self-censorship by American studios who are not going to be able today to make movies about social issues in China, or like The Life of the Dalai Lama, Kundun by Martin Scorsese, or Red Corner that he did about the judicial system in China. This will not happen today because of the influence of Chinese investors in the American studio. And so I think also highlighting how China is not only applying these rules of censorship in their own society for the Chinese people living there, but now increasingly also for the American studios and in the end for the American audience, I think this should worry everybody. Because I think one sentence that I think was very important by Richard, he said, "I'm most concerned about the soul of movie making and storytelling, and what the impact of these, state-owned, Chinese companies that, control the market, the movie market in China can have." And I think this should be a wake-up call, for journalists, for people who believe in freedom of expression, also as a way to hold the governments accountable. And I think we can see in the United States in this moment, there is a lot of, animosity about how the media, holds accountable the government or doesn't do that, and the role of fake news and all of that. I mean, we have a discussion about that, and people may disagree on what is good or what is not, true. But in China, this is not at all allowed. There's no way in which, a decision by Xi Jinping can be questioned by any media or by a movie or by a newspaper. And so I think this is a world in which none of us wishes to live.
Thank you for that, Matteo. I'd like to go back to another audience question now, and this one's going to be a little bit off topic, but this is from, I believe it's Steve Beeson, and the question is actually about the Panchen Lama. Mm-hmm. And so Steve asks, is it possible for a question about the whereabouts of the true Panchen Lama chosen by the Dalai Lama to be presented to the Chinese? So can the Chinese be asked about the whereabouts of the Panchen Lama? And I know that this is actually something that the Chinese government was forced to talk about pretty recently, so maybe you can get into that.
Yes, I mean, there has been a lot of questions over the years, now over several decades, to the Chinese government about what happened to the Panchen Lama and where he would be now, and what's his situation. The questions came from many governments, from the United States government, from European governments, but also from the United Nations many times, special procedures, how they call them. The UN have officially requested the Chinese government to clarify the situation. Even 5 years ago, we were in Geneva. We had a side event with Sarah Sewell, who was the special coordinator for Tibetan issues at the time. And we had an event inside the UN at the presence of governments to talk about the situation in Tibet. And actually, a couple of Chinese diplomats, young diplomats, quite junior, they showed up at the meeting, and they actually spoke and said, yes, the Panchen Lama is fine. And, when people ask why, don't you allow the UN or independent, people to have access to him, the answer was that we want to respect his privacy. He doesn't want to be disturbed. So you have the paradox of a country that doesn't respect the right to privacy for any Chinese citizen, who can be controlled from morning to night in all his online communications, whatever you buy. It was mentioned today, and this is something ICT is working on, also monitoring the development of this social credit scoring system in China, where you're going to have not only your economic history being monitored to see if you're a good, customer or good, creditor, but actually if you have a good social score. So if you behave like a good citizen. And what does it mean to behave like a good citizen in China? Probably, means you don't go to any demonstration. You don't write anything online that is, criticizes the government. You don't talk to friends, maybe, badly about the government or your local officials. So a government that doesn't respect any, semblance of privacy for citizens is now saying that the Panchen Lama cannot be disturbed after he was kidnapped with his own family when he was 6 years old because of the right to privacy. So, this needs to be called out, and it was important for the U.S. government this year to issue a statement by Secretary Pompeo on the occasion of his birthday to remind the Chinese people that the world has not forgotten about the Panchen Lama.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is shocking to think of how young the Panchen Lama still is, and he still has many years. He can be reunited with his people to guide them spiritually. So thank you for that answer, and thank you, Steve, for the question. We're running a little bit low on time here, so let me just get to a final couple questions here. Yeah. So reciprocity obviously was a big topic during today's hearing, but in addition to that, Richard also asked the senators to co-sponsor the Tibetan Policy and Support Act and to raise it with the Senate leadership for swift passage. As many of our viewers know, the TPSA will dramatically upgrade U.S. support for the Tibetan people, and one particular thing it will do is address the succession of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So Matteo, what's the latest on the TPSA, and what can ICT members do now to help advance the bill?
So the latest is that TPSA is now before the Senate after it was passed by the House in January. It's still on the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Senate, and we are hopeful that at the next business meeting, which hasn't been scheduled yet by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, TPSA will be on the agenda. It was on the agenda of the previous meeting, but due to some technical issues and limited time for discussion during that specific meeting, that bill with few others was postponed. So there is interest in the Senate leadership, both from Democrats and Republicans, to pass this bill, but we haven't got there yet. So it is important for people who are watching to take a minute and go to www.safetibet.org TPSA-Senate. Got it right? Okay. Perfect. That's the website where you can sign a petition and ask your senator either to co-sponsor or to call on Senator Rich, who's the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, to put it on the agenda for a vote at the next business meeting. This would be extremely important if the Senate were to pass it, and then the president to sign the bill, because it will upgrade U.S. policy on Tibet, and it will make sure in particular that the selection of the next Dalai Lama, if the Chinese government wishes and intends to continue with its plan to interfere in the selection, this won't happen without a strong reaction from the United States, which would mean sanctioning individually all the Chinese officials who are responsible for such interference.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. It's safetibet.org/TPSA-Senate. So please go there, as Matteo said, fill out the petition and ask your senators to get this bill passed this year. So we're looking forward to that. So Matteo, we are just about out of time here, but I do have to ask you one final thing before we go. We are less than a week away now from a very important date. So can you tell our audience what is going to happen on July 6th and what we as ICT will be doing to celebrate it?
Yes, July 6th is the 85th birthday of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And so it's a special day for the Tibetan people, but for all people who love His Holiness. And we know that there are millions out there, many, many millions of people who love him and actually can now also enjoy some of his teachings online. And he has been doing regularly conversations, teachings live from India in the morning, usually Eastern time. It's around 11:30. Pacific time, it's a little bit better. It's around 8 p.m. But you can check his schedule on dalailama.com if you want to hear from him. But as ICT, we'll have a special edition of our Tibet Talks, which will happen on July 6th at 12 noon. And for this, we will have as a guest the first representative of His Holiness in the United States, Mr. Tenzin Tetong, who was also one of the founders, actually the founder of ICT, was the first president more than 30 years ago. But before that, he was the person who worked to make the first visits of His Holiness to the United States. And so we want to talk to him and recall how the situation was 30, 40 years ago when His Holiness arrived here before getting the Nobel Peace Prize, and understanding the challenges that they had at the time, and what is the legacy that has been built out of those visits to the United States. And right after that, we'll have a selected number of ICT members, people who have been with us for a long time and have shown great support and generosity, but also have something to say about their experiences with His Holiness Dalai Lama. And so what we wanted to do is to give the voice of the people, of ICT members who are drawn to ICT and to our work because of the love and respect they have for His Holiness and for his vision, and also hear from them. It may be a different conversation, not about policy, not too much about Washington, but really looking and hearing from the heart of people who have experienced meeting with His Holiness, have experienced the beauty of Tibetan culture, of Tibetan Buddhism, and have that kind of conversation for a special day. And so that's how we wanted to honor his legacy, which has planted seeds in many hearts throughout the United States.
Yeah, it's going to be a really incredible event. I know we're all here at ICT really looking forward to it, and we hope that all of you will join us for that. So again, that'll be Monday, July 6th at noon Eastern Time. And you can watch it where you're watching this live stream right now, either on our Facebook page or on our website at savetibet.org/live. So please join us for that. I know Matteo and I would like to thank everybody who's watching this live. Thank you for taking part in this event. Thank you for watching Richard's testimony. And thank you for your support of ICT and His Holiness the Dalai Lama. We wish all of you here in the United States a happy 4th of July weekend. Should be an exciting time. And we wish that all of you watching all around the world have continued good health and safety. So thank you, and Tuk Che.
Ciao, Tuk Che. Bye-bye.